Is life meaningless? That's a pretty tough question to start off the video with right away, but also it's a very important question and one that our generation and recent generations have been struggling with more and more. And oftentimes that is because many feel like the answer to that question is yes, life is meaningless. And oddly enough, it does seem in one book of the Bible, at least right off the bat, that they agree. And by they, I mean the author of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Bible. As soon as you open up the book of Ecclesiastes, in the second verse, you will read, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity." Everything the author, who is often attributed to Solomon, by the way, writes is striving after the wind. Right away, this sounds like it's straight out of a nihilistic philosopher or something, somebody of the secular world and not of the Bible. But what's strange enough is that this entire book is diving deep into these type of realizations about the world and what we are to do about it. But although this more modern or secular form of nihilism may seem nearly identical to Ecclesiastes on first glance, it isn't the same when it comes to the resolution of what we are to do in the face of apparent meaningless. And so today, I want to go over the book of Ecclesiastes very briefly and very broadly to show how it differs from more modern or secular views of nihilism, and I hope that you will stick around because it's something I'm very excited about. Ecclesiastes starts off very brutally honest, not only with that verse we just read, where it states, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," and that is Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 2. But if you go a little bit further to Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9, you read, "What has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun." And then just a few verses later, in verse 14, you read, "And I have seen everything that is done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity, and a striving after the wind." The writer, and again, this is often attributed to Solomon, is looking at life under the sun. This phrase, "under the sun," is repeated so much in this book that I wouldn't be surprised if it was upward of 50 times. But what it means is essentially looking at life from the ground level, or looking at it from a purely worldly perspective, void of God. And when you take it from that perspective, in the perspective of Solomon, everything just seems meaningless. It's all a striving after the wind. And it seems like Solomon, even in his endless wisdom and blessing of wisdom that he got from God, isn't enough to fulfill this meaning under the sun, at least. As we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 18, "For in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases in knowledge increases sorrow." And this holds a couple different meanings. First off, it just means no matter how much you accumulate, whether or not it is wisdom, it is physical possessions, it's worth, whatever it may be, all of it in the end is just striving after the wind. If you really think about it, no matter how much you try and justify or try to create your own meaning, it really is for nothing at all if we don't have any inherent value within ourselves. But what it also means, and I find this very interesting, is that the more you learn, the more, in a way, you realize how meaningless life really is, because you will grow more in wisdom, not only of that which is good, but that which is bad. It is both a blessing and a curse in a way to grow in wisdom. And we see this echoed yet again in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 10 through 11, where Solomon writes, "Whatever my eyes desired, I did not keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Then I considered all that my hands had done, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after the wind. And there was nothing to be gained under the sun." I paraphrase that just a little bit. I'll include the full verse on screen if you want to pause and read it. But essentially, this really helps to summarize what the ancient view of nihilism really is. And that is that everything ends and seems to have an arbitrary just stopping point where there's no point for preparing for anything beyond that. And that in the end, everything really does hold no real meaning. However, Ecclesiastes has something that more modern forms of nihilism don't, and that is a redemptive promise or something beyond the earth. But now, if we jump forward a couple thousand years, more modern forms of nihilism or nihilistic philosophy seem to echo the same exact thing that Ecclesiastes was. However, without the last remaining hope that Ecclesiastes was able to provide, that we will get into later. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was probably the most popular nihilistic philosopher, famously stated that God is dead. And unlike what many people think, he did not say this as a victory speech and as a happy statement. He said it as one that uttered fear within him. He realized by stating this that Western civilization had truly lost faith in God in mass or in a very large scale. And his fear was that with the death of God, then came the death of meaning as a whole. And the effects that that could have on civilization were terrifying, not only to him, but to many others. Because of this giant realization, it came to a point where Nietzsche realized that the only meaning that could exist, or he could hope to exist, was that man would have to make his own meaning. And this was not a solid foundation upon which meaning can be reliably built. Essentially had to accept that there was no purpose, there was no design to the world, and that everybody simply has to make up meaning as we go. But that means that really there is no ultimate meaning. A meaning would be completely subjective, and thereby there was no real reason to believe that humans really had any intrinsic worth at all. This was then explored further by philosophers like Albert Camus, who had to realize in the end that we have to try and long for meaning apart from God, but as much as we strive to find meaning within the universe remains silent. This led to Albert Camus famously ending his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus, by simply stating, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." If you don't know what the myth of Sisyphus is, not the essay, but the myth as a whole, Sisyphus in Greek mythology was a man who was forced for eternity to push a boulder up a mountain, but right before the boulder got to the top, it would roll all the way back down. And he'd have to do this over and over and over ad infinitum. Essentially, what Camus was saying is that as far as the search for meaning within this life goes, you have to accept the absurdity of it. You have to keep on pushing the boulder up the hill, even though you will never find true meaning. You have to find joy within the struggle, and that's the best we get. But returning to Ecclesiastes, how is it any different? It starts off just as dark, and it starts off portraying the same meaninglessness that we find in secular nihilism. In fact, we see this even more closer to this same secular nihilism that we've already gone over. In fact, we read in Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 2, "It is the same for all, since the same event happens to the righteous and the wicked, to the good and the evil, to the clean and the unclean, to him who sacrifices and him who does not sacrifice. As the good one is, so is the sinner, and he who swears is as he who shuns an oath." And then just a few verses later in verse 5 we read, "For the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing, and they have no more reward, for the memory of them is forgotten." But here is the very big difference. That phrase we discussed of earlier, under the sun, it does not stop getting repeated over and over and over. That is the key. Everything may seem meaningless under the sun, but what is beyond is the furthest thing from meaningless that you can find. The author returns frequently to moments of light and goodness within life where you could find things that are not illusions of something that is good, but actually good gifts like love and joy and happiness. Returning back to Ecclesiastes chapter 2, in verse 24 we read, "There is nothing better for a person than that he should eat and drink and find enjoyment in his toil." That sounds similar to Camus, but continue on. "This also I saw is from the hand of God." This is what separates the seemingly nihilistic nature of Ecclesiastes from the more secular nature that we find in people like Nietzsche. Where Nietzsche only saw the death of God, Solomon saw the hand of God. Solomon, and in Ecclesiastes we see that without God, secular philosophy is absolutely right. Nihilism is true, and there truly is zero objective, absolute, or even reliable meaning in the world. But with God, everything changes. Even the smallest piece of joy is with God extending his hand and giving us a gift. And everything in this life, all the toil, is to be overcome in the name of godliness, and so that we can bring the heaven down to earth. And we see the same sort of conclusion being arrived at the end of Ecclesiastes, where in chapter 12, starting at verse 9, we read, "Besides being wise, the preacher also taught the people knowledge, weighing and studying and arranging many proverbs with great care. The preacher sought to find words of delight, and uprightly he wrote words of truth. The words of the wise are like goads, and like nails firmly fixed are the collected sayings. They are given by one shepherd. My son, beware of anything beyond these. Of making many books there is no end, and much study is a weariness of the flesh. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commands, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil." Something that I haven't mentioned yet that is very fascinating is that when you read the verses that state vanity of vanities, for example, Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 2, the word for vanity there is the Hebrew word havor. This word is fascinating when it comes to this discussion because it holds a great metaphor with it. The word havor means smoke or wind or vapor. And essentially, the metaphor that can be made here, and the metaphor that I believe was intended in the first place, is that just as you can see smoke and reach and grasp it, and suddenly it goes away, it can also be translated to the fact that oftentimes, although we know that there is meaning there from God, we reach and we grasp for it, and we can't get a hold of it. And so oftentimes life does seem meaningless to us. And so yes, the conclusion is that life often does seem meaningless sometimes. Solomon was not afraid to admit that. No Christian really is afraid to admit that. We all struggle sometimes to find meaning in our lives. But we shouldn't be afraid to admit that, because reading Ecclesiastes, it doesn't end in despair. It ends in a sort of acceptance. And it ends in a sort of reverence, not a fake optimism, but in a realization that if God exists, then so does meaning, even if sometimes we can struggle to see it. So then, secular nihilism devolves down into saying no real, true meaning exists, while Ecclesiastes says there is absolutely meaning, even if under the sun it can be very hard to clearly see sometimes. So what I would urge you guys to do, beyond just studying this as fascinating as it really is that when you are struggling to find meaning in your faith, in your life, remember to look beyond what is under the sun. Gaze into heaven. Seek not to just find mere temporary meaning here on earth, but seek to find the one who established and gave you meaning in the first place. That is all I have for you guys today. I hope that this was an interesting video. I hope that maybe this more philosophical type of stuff you found interesting, because this is the stuff I really love. It's just sometimes I struggle to do it because I'm afraid I'm going to mess it up, and I take it so seriously that I don't want to mess anything up largely. And so what I'm simply going to ask is that you please give me any feedback you have. Let me know any thoughts you have on this. I'd love to hear any thoughts about the philosophical side of it, the biblical side of it, the theological side of it, kind of merging the two, and any other thoughts you may have. But regardless, thank you again for watching, and I hope you have a very blessed day.